I will, as ever, give some introductory thoughts about what we heard yesterday, and then my colleagues will go into more detail. What you're going to hear is one presentation from Carl Emerson on the short-term bit of the budget, the emergency bit on the coronavirus. Then Isabel Stockton will talk about the public finances. Ben Zaranko will talk about the spending pledges, and Stuart Adam will talk about the tax policies that we heard about. So the fact that we had two budgets, one an emergency, the other the sort of long-term intentions, made everything a little bit odd because the long-term budget was based on a set of forecasts which now look dramatically out of date. So all the forecasts, as you know, for the core budget were put together before any significant effect of the coronavirus was accounted for, and so we're out of date at the moment of publication. Now, if it turns out that the short-term disruption caused by coronavirus is just short-term, then that's fine. But as things carry on, that's looking, I have to say, more unlikely by the day. Any significant longer-term effect and a smaller economy will mean tax and spending plans set out yesterday, leading to an even bigger deficit than currently planned. So what are the headlines from the budgets? The two budgets, I really think we should think of these as two separate events. Carl will talk more about the coronavirus package. It appears to be what it was promised to be, timely, targeted, temporary. At £12 billion, it also looks pretty substantial. Looks fairly well designed. It remains to be seen whether it will be enough to support public services, the vulnerable, and insulate the economy from long-term effects. As far as the economic forecasts are concerned, I think we've talked rather too little about those. These are the forecasts pre-coronavirus. They're pretty weak, even before factoring in the coronavirus. Projected growth rates averaging barely over 1.5% a year for the next 5 years are feeble, frankly, and they're indicative of an economy that is not in a robust position to deal with shocks like the coronavirus. And the OBR continues to assume an orderly move to a free trade agreement with the European Union. Again, anything less orderly, failure to achieve such an agreement would weaken an already weak outlook. On the spending side, it's set to rise by 76 billion or 9% in real terms between this year and 23-24, largely paid for by extra borrowing. That's a big increase in spending. That's a big increase in borrowing. It'll increase the size of the state, public spending as a fraction of national income, to 41% of national income, near enough. That's above pre-crisis levels, so that's above the size of the state over which the last Labour government was presiding, bigger than at any time since the mid-1980s, other than when the economy shrank during the crisis. So it's a genuinely big change in the size of the state. The investment spending plans are huge. The intention is to get to the manifesto ceiling of 3% of national income in really very short order. That will take investment spending to its highest level in what I'm calling modern times, essentially since we stopped owning piles of nationalised industries. There's a big challenge here, and I think it's a really big challenge, and one we don't talk about enough, which is ensuring that all of that money is well spent. It's all very well to say we're going to spend all that money. Ensuring that it is well spent is not going to be easy. I think a really important point here, which has not again come across, is that the current spending plans really aren't anything like as generous as they appear or as Mr. Sunak made them sound. Average annual increases of 2.8% sound substantial, but once you take account of the need to replace European Union funding, factor in planned increases for health and schools and the defence and overseas aid promises, there's actually not very much there for other departments. So if the spending envelope is stuck to, if it is, then there are plenty of public services which won't be enjoying much in the way of spending increases. They also look suspiciously front-loaded. If you look in the document, you see big increases over the next couple of years and then nothing much for the couple of years after that. That makes one wonder whether there will be top-ups in later budgets and a need for more tax or more borrowing. In terms of level, current spending per person will remain below 2010-11 levels even by the middle of the 2020s if you look outside of health. There's a chart in the OBR document which shows current spending per person returning to 2010-11 levels overall. That's true, but outside of health, it'll still be really very substantially lower. Again, pre-coronavirus, the Chancellor is on target to achieve his surplus on the current budget. There are clearly risks around that, even ignoring the increased uncertainty that we have at the moment. There's still a big chance of missing that. And you add on coronavirus, add on risks around the trade deal, we might, there are serious risks of not hitting that target. Even if we do hit the target, borrowing will still peak at 67 billion. That's nearly 30 billion above its level last year. That's a much looser target than the 2% deficit targeted by Mr. Hammond, and far looser than George Osborne's target of getting to overall budget balance. It is worth saying, though, that this is all consistent with pre-election promises. The Chancellor was correct in saying that he was essentially taking the manifesto and delivering it. And finally, it's worth saying that on these forecasts, underlying debt will rise slightly relative to national income. So that's not consistent with the plans in the manifesto. And of course, if growth turns out less positive, which seems pretty likely, then debt could easily start moving decisively upwards. So just a little more detail on those before I hand over to my colleagues. On the coronavirus package, as I say, it's a substantial, well-targeted package on what it's trying to achieve. It's necessarily limited. I think on the business side, it is aimed pretty particularly at those businesses which might face a demand shock, hospitality, retail, and so on. It does much less, actually, for businesses who might end up having a supply shock because their workforces can't turn up, either because they're ill or they're self-isolating or schools closed and they need to look after children. One thought that might be a particular issue for manufacturing industry where home working is pretty hard. Might be an issue for a large chunk of the economy. There are individuals among the self-employed who won't get much help from this. And remember, a large fraction of the population have very low levels of liquid savings. So even a short-term knock on incomes or employment can cause real problems. Mr. Sunak has said he'll be ready to do more if necessary. I'm sure he'll be monitoring the effectiveness of the package, and it wouldn't surprise me if he comes back with more at some point. On the public finances, spending and borrowing are both rising, and they're doing so in a way which, as I said, appears consistent with the Conservative manifesto, but which is quite different from the paths forged by previous chancellors. Ever lower borrowing costs, though, do mean that this looks sustainable for now, but of course there are risks. The first is that with a debt stock more than twice what it was pre-crisis, shorter maturities, and a financing requirement which is about 50% higher as a share of national income than it was prior to the crisis, we are vulnerable to changes in interest rates, to inflation, and to growth. Secondly, debt is not falling over this period, during which growth, however feeble, appears to be at its new normal. Debt would grow sharply in the face of a downturn. I think one could argue that what's being done is not consistent with Mr. Osborne's mantra of fixing the roof while the sun is shining, even if the sun is shining pretty weakly. Most importantly, I think in terms of risks, particularly for the government, is, as I said, the current framework and set of policies don't look likely to deliver the kinds of spending growth that were implied. Outside of health and a few other protected areas, it looks like little will be available to increase spending. Real day-to-day spending on public services will eventually require tax rises. Mr. Sunak proudly announced that day-to-day departmental spending will enjoy an average growth rate of 2.8%, twice as fast as the economy. Now, it should be absolutely obvious to anyone you can't increase public spending twice as fast as the economy ad infinitum without increasing taxes or borrowing. So there's a risk, I think, that expectations will be disappointed. We've got a review of the fiscal framework promised. That's welcome, and it's better than just changing it on the hoof. It's worth saying, though, that you can't get round the iron laws of the fiscal arithmetic. The only way that a change in the fiscal rules can actually help justify more spending without tax rises will be if the Chancellor says, I'm happy to see underlying debt rise more quickly. So if he's not happy to see that happen, then changing the fiscal rules isn't going to help him spend more or tax less. We'll have to wait and see whether he is happy with that. I think we also need to think very hard about the extent to which the current framework favours capital spending. Not all capital spending is good, not all current spending is bad. I think there's a real risk that we'll end up misallocating spending because there's so much money being poured into capital, and whilst current spending remains tight, that's not necessarily the best allocation. These sorts of arbitrary distinctions can be costly. Chancellor talked about levelling up without still really defining what it means, but whatever it means, it's going to require a lot more than investing in capital projects. It will require an industrial strategy, education policy, local government spending, and a whole lot more over a generation, not over a parliament. How much you invest in roads and rail in the northeast, it's not going to change the fact that they have a workforce which is only half as likely to be graduates as is the case in London. There are big differences that go way beyond public spending across regions. Finally, I think it's worth saying that I've seen, particularly on social media, quite a lot of reports suggesting that this budget in some way accepts what Labour were proposing at the last election. I think that's very wide of the mark. This is essentially genuinely delivering on the Conservative manifesto, which, as we said at the time, bore no relationship at all, really, to what was in the Labour manifesto. So quite different to what Conservative chancellors have done in the past, but really quite consistent with what the Conservative Party put in front of the population. Say a few words about taxes. It was a tax-raising budget overall, largely because of the decision not to cut corporation tax as previously legislated. And again, there were quite a lot of little promises in the manifesto which were largely delivered in the budget. But that said, the package of tax changes looks piecemeal. I can't see any particular strategy underneath them. It's a general complaint we have. Mr. Sunak has an opportunity of a second budget to remedy that. Clearly, one area where a strategy is desperately required is on how to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. The government is signed up to that. Now, strategy is due later this year, so perhaps a lack of direction this time round is forgivable. But the set of decisions in the budget don't give me great confidence that the government's willing to grasp the nettle. Failure even to maintain the real value of fuel duties whilst the oil price is collapsing really isn't terribly encouraging. Reducing the scope of red diesel is more encouraging, but allowing the relief to continue to farmers and some other users isn't. I mean, it's either, creating carbon dioxide or it isn't. Changes to the climate change levy to recognise the role of gas in greenhouse gas emissions does make sense, but there's no sign whatever of any appetite to tackle household consumption. We've got wildly different costs of carbon according to what fuel is used and by whom. So tackling that is surely a priority. Restriction to entrepreneurs relief to gains of 1 million is welcome. Shame that it's still there at all, but taking it down from 10 to 1 is better than nothing. Finally, Stuart will say a lot more about the solution to the so-called doctor's pension problem. It was essentially to push the other issue further up the income distribution. Means far fewer people will be affected by the tapering away of pension tax relief, but it does remain a pretty poorly designed bit of policy. And there are still a whole load of fundamental issues to be sorted out in the taxation of pensions, including the fact that defined benefit schemes, which happen to be the sorts of things that politicians and civil servants have, are treated far more generously than defined contribution schemes, which the rest of us have. Excessively generous treatment by the national insurance system, the generous treatment of lump sums, the favouring of pension pots as a vehicle for inheritances. It would be good to see a proper piece of work and strategy on pension taxation as ever. So, in conclusion, only time will tell whether the numbers in the budget will have any meaning at all once the economic effects of coronavirus become fully evident. On the basis of the pre-virus forecast, it was a budget that largely delivered on manifesto commitments on borrowing and spending. It will result in a big increase in borrowing. Investment spending is planned to rise quickly. The tax changes promised in the manifesto are being legislated. But there are lots of risks and omissions lurking in there. The biggest risks, I think, relate to difficulties in spending the cash set aside for investment projects and spending it effectively, and on the other hand, disappointing expectations on current spending. In the longer term, obviously higher debt and borrowing carry their own risks. The lack of any coherent strategy on tax is a long-standing gripe, for us at least. The lack of strategy on net zero will hopefully be sorted out eventually. A second budget will give the new Chancellor a chance to stake out his ground. As for the coronavirus response, looks like a sensible package. I've no idea how effective it will be, quite frankly. Mr. Sunak has promised to do whatever is needed, and more may be needed. If, as seems likely at the moment, the long-term path of the economy is affected, then he'll also need to reassess much more of his fiscal strategy when he returns to the dispatch box in the autumn. So that's my overall take on where we got to yesterday. As I said, my colleagues will now take you through a lot of the details on that. Thank you.